Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. Transforming Trauma is presented by the NARM Training Institute. I'm your host, Emily Ruth, and I'm so glad you've joined us today. Hi, Transforming Trauma listeners. Do you want to join the international NARM community in support of trauma-informed care? If so, please consider joining us in 2023 to become trained in the neuroaffective relational model. The Level 1 online NARM Basics training is designed for helping professionals in a variety of fields, such as mental health professionals, substance abuse counselors, educators, doctors, nurses, other healthcare providers, coaches, and more. If you are a licensed mental health practitioner, you can join the Level 2 NARM Therapist training. This Level 2 training is a clinical training designed for licensed mental health professionals, current mental health graduate students, and active clinical interns and trainees, where you will get trained in a comprehensive developmental framework and clinical approach for resolving the long-term impacts of ACEs and CPTSD. For more information on these trainings and to apply, please visit narmtraining.com/schedule. We hope you will join us in 2023 for learning how to transform trauma. And now for the interview. This year has brought many rich conversations to the podcast. The team here at Transforming Trauma is grateful to the guests and for you, our listener, for joining us on our mission to transform trauma. In this year-end episode, Brad Kammer and I reflect on podcast highlights from 2022 and explore some memorable moments. I hope you enjoy this conversation with NARM Training Director Brad Kammer.
All right. Well, this is a treat to be with you, Emily, here for our end of the year reflection about how transforming trauma went this year, and welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Brad.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it feels like it's been so many years we've been doing this, but I was looking back and we just really started around this time last year.
Yeah, about a year ago.
Yeah. So, we like to just kind of slow down at the end of the year, check in, reflect, learn. And so, we have no script for this. We have no plan. We just wanted to kind of check in. And I'd love to hear about how your first year at the helm of Transforming Traumas went. And then we can get more into the details about, what you've learned and what's impacted you. But just how's this first year with Transforming Trauma been for you?
When we first started talking about doing this episode, I just went through and I listed off all of the folks I've been able to talk with this last year. And oh, it's so rich. It's so wonderful to be able to talk to so many people from different areas of the field and talk about something that I feel so passionate about and learn from them. And it's been really beautiful for me. And, I'm still pretty much at the beginning of my career here, even though it's a second career for me. I just feel so fortunate to be able to hear so many different perspectives and to think of trauma and the work that I'm, trying to do from so many different angles. So that's been such a treat. Yeah.
Mm. Well, I'm sure I'll say this at the end when we're wrapping up, but I just have so appreciated the spirit you've brought. And, I get to listen to the raw first version. Sometimes we do a little edits just to clean things up, but mostly we keep it. But there's been many moments you've been really touched and moved and had emotions. And I love how you've allowed yourself to be human and be open. And just the spirit of the connections I've been really touched by. So thank you for bringing that energy, which is very NARM aligned, the heartfulness, the openness, the curiosity.
Yeah. And thank you for, letting me know that was okay to show up and just be human and not feel like I had to be completely polished and great interviewer. I could just be curious and ask questions and know that showing up in that way was not only acceptable, but that was what was wanted. That really has meant a lot to me.
You mean you were putting pressure on yourself?
I might have been putting pressure on myself in the beginning. I was like, oh, I have some big shoes to fill. This has been such an amazing podcast. I was a fan long before it was on the radar for me. So I had already been appreciating so much of what I had learned in that first few years of the podcast. And so I felt like I was pressuring myself at the beginning, even though I was trying not to. But yeah, this last year, I felt so much permission again to just show up and be human and ask questions. And it was okay for me to not have answers, that it was actually wanted for me to ask questions. It was fun. It was really fun. It's been really fun.
That's something we take out of the NARM trainings, is just the way that we learn how much pressure we put on ourselves in our roles. I mean, so much of the trainings are about helping professionals and therapists, but it's sometimes shocking how, little things even to big things, how much pressure we put on ourselves. And it really serves to dehumanize
Mhm.
us and objectify us because we're not perfect. Humans are not perfect. And the creativity often comes when we allow ourselves to be more messy, to be more open. And again, I just really have appreciated how you've modeled that. And
Mm.
so I'm glad we were able to stay in that. And I love watching you grow and learn in that role as well.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that.
So, we both have kind of looked back at the list of 2022 here, and, we've had some just incredible people on. I mean, I don't even know where to start.
Mhm.
Maybe I'll just ask you, like, what jumps out in terms of like thinking about some of the folks you've connected with this year?
Well, I told you I made a list of everyone, and I don't even know how to whittle it down. How can we whittle this list down? Because I don't wanna leave anyone out. Because every single one has really touched me in a different way and helped me learn something and consider something for myself, new from a different angle that I hadn't thought about. And so, but looking back, probably one of the first couple interviews, we talked to Daniel Shaw
Mm,
and his view and what he taught us about narcissism. I just hadn't thought about it in that way before. And so there was a lot of learning there for me. And I tried to engage with some of his content that he's put out. He has a few books that I know in the level 3 training you talk a lot about his books, and so it kind of was a nice way to start off this work for me to really engage and dive into his work, and I don't know, I'm curious what you thought about the episode, what came up for you when you heard it?
Yeah, we've had him on twice. So before you came on board, we had him, and then we had him on again just because so many of us have been really impacted by his work. I think he, at this time that we're living in, with just a lot of narcissism all around us in a lot of different ways, including within
Mhm.
all of us to some extent. And really taking an honest look at the dynamics that are around us and inside of us. And I appreciated, I don't remember specifically right now what you guys were talking about during your episode, but I just appreciate how he humanizes these dynamics that are very painful and often very scary to actually look at and address, particularly when they're within us as parents or as therapists, as helping professionals. We don't like to think of, having narcissistic patterns inside of us, but I think he really brings it up in a way that helps to humanize it
Mhm.
for so
Yeah,
many
that's
people.
right. That's exactly what really stuck with me, and I hadn't really held myself in that way of, like, considering the narcissism inside of myself, and so, it could be really easy to kinda shame myself about what I see coming up, but like you said, he really kind of humanizes it, and that was really important for me.
Another thing I like about Daniel Shaw's, I think this is changing actually, but I don't know. I feel like in the old days, a lot of these kind of experts, they didn't pull the curtain. They didn't show you what was behind the curtain. And that always to me felt a little bit, I don't know, out of integrity or something. And there's something about the way he just shares so openly about his experiences. He was in a cult and, how that impacted him and how that then turned into his life's work. I really value people that are able to do that. And, we try to do that to the best of our ability in NARM. But I appreciated how much he did that. And also, someone who's written a bunch of books now and, kind of an expert in this field, just his ongoing
Mhm.
learning and continuing to get ongoing training and ongoing consultation. He's not this finished product. He's continuing to learn and develop himself, which again, I think shined through in the way that he shows up
Mhm.
in podcasts like ours and other places. Yeah.
Yeah, I've been following him on Facebook, and he's kind of posting some kind of ongoing, like, learnings thing like you said, peeling back the curtain and sharing things that he's learning even still, so that's been pretty cool.
This reminds me, this kind of flips to another episode that you did with Dr. Jenna Vasquez.
Mm.
I know Jenna for some years now because Jenna and I met years ago when I was teaching in Austin. And then she came into our first NARM training in Austin and then became one of our organizers and training assistants. And then she went back to get her PhD and did her dissertation on self-care outcomes, I believe, for
Mm.
trauma therapists, and specifically focusing on trauma therapists that were getting ongoing trauma training. And she narrowed it down to NARM just because that's what she was part of and that's where her community was. So it was kind of one of our first dissertations, at least in the United States, specifically on NARM. And the results were incredible. I know it's just one research study. They were incredible. She presented it at the International Trauma Conference in
Mhm.
Boston in May, Bessel van der Kolk's conference. And I just really enjoyed you learning and having her share with us about her results. And the impact of, for those of us that are working in the trauma field, how important it is for us to practice our own self-care. And a big part of that self-care is about ongoing training, development, community, which is really aligned with the NARM Institute and what we're trying to create here. So I don't know if there was anything that kind of jumped out from Jenna's.
Well, I just remember feeling like in my body, I think I even said in the interview, I felt like my skin was like vibrating, like buzzing. I was so excited to hear what her findings were and what she was sharing. And again, I just remember feeling so fortunate that here I am, relatively in the beginning of my career, and that this is how I'm coming into the field, that I'm recognizing the importance of self-care, and that I, am working with this model that rather than, I don't know how to say this, but like I could go and I could learn a model, and I've been in other trainings, and the model can be helpful, but I could potentially use it to shame myself. Like, oh, I don't have this good enough, or I don't have this skill developed enough. And in NARM, we hold it in such a way that the more we learn, the more gentle I can hold myself with it. And I just feel so fortunate about that. And that's what really she was talking about, how it landed for me. And so I was just so excited. I was like, give me more, tell me more. Yeah, that was a fun interview.
Yeah, the phrase I couldn't capture a moment ago is called quality of life for therapists. That was like the topic, quality of life for therapists, and how much she stressed personal work and ongoing development, like just how important that is for us. And whether we're new in the field, like, you've been talking about yourself, or whether we've been a long time in the field, just how powerful this profession really is. I mean, not just therapists, for any helping professional that's working with trauma or just living in this time right now.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of stuff on social media about self-care. What does that really look like? And what does that mean? And what are things that can really help us, not just on the surface, but deeper? And so we did make her dissertation available on the website for people that want to actually read through it. It's super interesting and it's very accessible. She wrote it in a way that's not too hard to read. And you'll see the actual specific factors of quality of life and self-care that she actually points to that through her research. Again, I wish I could capture some of those right now, but I'll let people find that themselves and read through it.
Yeah, great, cool. Well, let's see. What was next? We talked about Dr. Sandy Bloom. I mentioned before we pressed record that her interview really touched me. The richness of her background and how much she knows, and the way she showed up in that conversation. It felt so like humble, and so like it was just beautiful to hear her talk about what she learned from her clients and her patients. And that to me really stood out. Again, how do I want to hold the folks that I work with? How do I want to engage with them? And I feel like she models that so beautifully. And now that she's turning, and now she's kind of passing the baton and like sharing all of this rich knowledge that she's come to, and the wisdom there in that conversation was really, really special for me. So that's another one that stands out to me.
Yeah, I'll use this as an opportunity to pull the hood on how our process works here. I'm the executive producer of this podcast, and so I generally find the guests, and I often have a relationship to guests or some kind of connection to the guests. Sometimes people come to us, but usually that's how it happens. And Dr. Sandra Bloom was an interesting one because when I was in graduate school, I did a huge thesis, which was called Trauma in Civilization. It was a huge thesis. And one of the resources that really blew me away at that time was a book that she had written about her sanctuary model. I think the book was called Creating Sanctuary, but I don't remember exactly now. And I used a term that she had coined called traumatogenic forces. That basically, it was the first time I'd ever really heard that there was these forces within culture, within systems, within family systems, within relationships that are based fully in trauma patterns. And they're invisible, largely invisible. We just live with them. And, I had been looking at that individually with personality, but I hadn't quite understood how that related to these relational forces. And so I used her work quite a bit in my thesis. And I remember reading about the sanctuary model that she and her colleagues had created, and hearing her now, 20 some years later, talking about how it evolved over these years was really cool to hear. And like you said, just the wisdom of how she was kind of passing the baton was very cool. And that reminds me also of Nancy McWilliams too, the episode that you had with Dr. McWilliams. She is a giant in the field of psychodynamic therapy in the last 30, 40 years. And, I imagine she's also probably in that phase of her career as well. I don't recall if she talked about that, but her work has just influenced thousands and thousands of students and of therapists around the world. She has several very well-known books. And again, I found her to be also pulling back the hood in a certain way. She talked about her experiences when she was younger in college and how that shaped her, and just appreciated how much wisdom came out of her as well. Those two episodes kind of stood out to me in terms of having people that I've looked up to for a long time
Mm.
that we got the chance to talk to.
Yeah, that's so exciting.
Anything from your memories of that?
Pretty much what you said. I just remember feeling really touched by the work that she's done and how generous. I just remember feeling like she was so generous with her time. Kind of on a personal note, after we stopped the interview, we sat and talked for a while. Like she was willing to just kind of, share her time, and she let me ask some questions like on a personal level. And she just was so generous with her time and so encouraging. And that's really what I remember about her. And I feel like that really shows in her work and what she shared.
Another giant we had, I'd love to hear your memories on this, with Dr. Stephen Porges, who came on and talked with Larry and yourself. And
Mhm.
for those of you that haven't listened to that episode or don't know who Dr. Porges is, he's the creator of the polyvagal theory and very well known around the world, particularly in the trauma world. We've used a lot of his theory to support our understanding of how trauma impacts the brain and the nervous system. But wonder anything from that conversation stands out to you?
I just loved the way that he and Larry, like, engaged, and it felt like the underpinnings of so much what they were saying they had in common, but that they were seeing things from different angles, and that was just cool to kind of think about things in different ways and how they were sharing with each other and seeing, how they held things in similar ways and then maybe some differences that they kind of shared with each other. So that was exciting. I loved hearing that kind of dialogue and trying to think of what really stuck out at me. I was just appreciating the moment, honestly. I was like, here's two like giants in the field and I get to like be in the room. That was cool.
Yeah, I feel really grateful that he joined us for that.
Yeah. I'm thinking about the intergenerational love webinar that you and Larry did and shared with us. That was a cool, if listeners haven't heard that one yet, I would highly recommend going back to that one and I had heard it before, but listening back again when it was posted, there were a lot of things that were just so helpful. So that's another one that sticks out at me. I don't know if if there was anything around that you wanted to talk about.
Yeah, that came from, we have something in the NARM Training Institute we call the Inner Circle, which is an online program that we do. Every month we do a webinar on a specific topic. Usually it's within the field of complex trauma on some level, and we take a NARM perspective on that topic. So whether it's working with relationships or whether it's working with clients that have substance abuse issues, different elements of complex trauma. And sometimes we get into other kind of topics, and that topic is not so specifically about complex trauma, but it is about healing of complex trauma and how these intergenerational wounds that are real intergenerational trauma that impacts and creates complex trauma for the next generations. What about the other thread of it? The thread of what keeps us together, keeps us attached, keeps us connected, keeps babies coming, love on all the different levels. And we just don't talk enough, at least in the trauma world, about that. And I think I made a comment in there about how when I got my first textbook, when I started teaching, because for many years I've taught at community college and then other universities and graduate programs. But I remember my first semester teaching at community college, I got the textbook and I went through it and there was nothing about love in the whole, 500 pages of psychology textbook. There was like things like altruism and stuff, but there was nothing about love. And I was like, wow, that says something about the field of psychology and how we look at humanity.
Yeah.
So it feels important in this trauma field. We spend a lot of time in these trauma trainings, really we have to, because we're dealing with really intense, scary, painful things, but it's important not to leave out that as people start to resolve some of these old pain patterns and fear patterns and shame patterns, they can reconnect to these things that make us most human, and love is a big part of that.
Yeah.
Maybe the biggest part of it. So
Yeah, I love that. You just put it in a nutshell of what I really loved about that episode. So if listeners haven't heard that, and if they want kind of a peek into what the inner circle is all about, that was kind of a little sneak peek that we shared.
yeah, I know we're kind of putting each other on the spot here to remember a lot of things that have happened this year, but I was thinking we've had a bunch of NARM therapists, and I wondered if anything stood out from the interviews you had with people like Crystal, Isaac, Kristen, and Jens. I'll have to go through and see if I'm sure I'm leaving a few folks out. But yeah, anything come to mind about any of those interviews with Carrie Griffin,
Yeah.
Joanne and Lynn, Kimberly Mead?
Yeah, gosh, all of them. That's why I'm saying it's a little hard to like, how do we narrow this down? Because all of them shared things that felt really important to me. And again, I just felt so lucky to have those conversations with them. Crystal's I loved how open she was with her own experience. Like, it's kind of a vulnerable thing to be a therapist and then be recorded on a podcast and have your story kind of out there.
Mm,
And I was just so struck with her willingness to really share her journey and what her experience has been, in the hopes that it might support someone else in their journey. And I just was really appreciative of what she shared. And a lot of what she shared, I could resonate with on a personal level. And so, yeah, I really enjoyed that conversation. Isaac, oh my gosh, he is just such a light. I don't know how else to talk about him, but I couldn't help but like smile for a lot of that conversation because of what he shared. I'm trying to remember what the title is, something about the joy of queer identity.
mm,
And I just really enjoyed that conversation and hearing more from him and what his experience has been. And I remember, I don't want to put words in his mouth because listeners can go listen to it if they haven't already heard it. But just that his perspective, the queer identity, a lot of focus can be on like the hard parts of that. And he was like, there's so much joy. Like, this is who I am. And I just really enjoyed that conversation with him. He was great.
mm.
And then Kirsten and Jens, like the whole parenting piece, I completely resonated with that as a mother and having my kiddos. I had a toddler at the time to teenager. And so what they shared really, I felt translated so well. And I remember for several weeks after that conversation, there were things that stuck out in the throes of parenting. There were several things that they said that I remember kind of came right in the moment when I needed it just to remember. So anyway, those were a few that popped up at me. How about you, Brad?
Yeah, I want to just name a few others just to make
Yeah.
sure we try to capture everyone. And then maybe one of your first conversations with Nadine, Dr.
Yes.
Nadine,
Mhm.
Prashant, you mentioned Kimberly, Mohammed, Galena, and then you did an interview with the staff, the clinical
Yeah.
staff of Sabino Recovery Center as well.
Mhm.
And yeah, I mean, each one of these just stood out to me in so many interesting and different ways. I love Nadine's story, of course. She has a great story and
Yeah, she does.
she's so good at telling it.
Mhm.
And there's something very powerful about something that a lot of us know the story of the Wolf on Wall Street, but to actually humanize it from her perspective and to hear how she used this abuse and these experiences to then become a therapist and dedicate herself to healing a lot of narcissistic wounding,
Mhm.
narcissistic abuse. That was fun to hear the two of you connect. And you had such a nice energy in that meeting. And
Yeah, that was a really fun one. I so enjoyed, and she's another one that afterward we talked for a while, and I just felt so lucky to kind of, have that connection with her. And she's one too. So she's written a book. And then also this was kind of a later, I don't know, later in life, where I'm in my 40s. But so we have that in common of kind of coming, to this as like a second career and to see really how she's affected so many lives. Now if you're familiar with her, she's on TikTok and she's affecting a lot of folks on social media and sharing her message and I think helping a lot of people. So that's been really fun to watch her journey there. So yeah, Dr. Nadine, Dr. Nay.
yeah, Dr. Nay, that's right.
Yeah.
An episode that I did with Bill Loki, and that really touched me. Bill came into our community at the last stage of his life. He's going through terminal cancer process, and him and his wife Lori came to the training, and I just was so inspired by. They basically said, "Hey, they're going to do what they want to do in this last phase of life. As long as he can get out of bed, they're going to do what they want to do."
Mm.
And they wanted to come to learn NARM. And he really inspired us. And I really appreciated that conversation. I hope to have a future conversation or two with Bill in this last period of his life. And I know for so many of us, at least in America, we do not do death and dying well at all. We don't do loss well at all. And I know I don't do it well either. And so, I want to learn, Bill is a role model in that way, just how courageous he's been. I'm not saying every day he wakes up and he's, modeling that for us because he's, I think, the first one to say that
Mhm.
there's good days and there's hard days. But those real conversations about people that are going through these really intense human things that we can't do a lot of change around, that impacted me a lot. He impacts me a lot, but just that time together also impacted me.
Yeah, that was a lovely conversation. That was another one that there were moments that felt like sacred. If that's okay to say that.
Yeah. Another one, this is not a NARM person, but I think I was excited about this meeting of
Mhm.
Clementine Morgan.
Mhm.
And you and I had both found her on social media well before we got a chance to talk with her. And yeah, that episode, I just was like, wow, she is dynamic
Yeah.
and courageous. And the way that she's living her trauma healing, she's not a therapist.
Mhm.
She's an advocate. She's a political and social activist. And the things that she's taking on, it just takes a lot of courage, a lot of belief in yourself to be able to do what she's doing.
Mhm.
And, her focus is a lot on, she kind of talks about cancel culture. That term is a little bit hard to define, but really what we look at from a NARM perspective is relational loss. And what happens when we try to stay in our authenticity, the fear of being excommunicated, the fear about being shamed, and how then we start to adapt our authenticity in order to stay in relationship. And, what she's basically kind of modeling for us is to really stay in your authenticity and believing in yourself and bringing that into the world in ways that are going to be in integrity with you, and then finding the people in the groups that are going to be open to that, and the groups that aren't, then learning to deal with that to the best of our abilities. And I just was so moved by her, and I like to learn more. I know she does organizational consulting. I'd love to learn more from her. There's a lot of different perspectives out there about how we deal with some of the social challenges we're dealing with.
Mhm.
And I think learning from these different perspectives is really important. And I think she has a really valuable one to offer.
Yeah, that's an exciting interview. If folks haven't heard that one yet, go back definitely and listen to that one. It'll get you thinking for sure.
Yeah, probably our most controversial one,
Yeah.
I would say, maybe. Definitely up there in the top two or
Yeah.
three.
Yeah.
Because there is a lot of ideology on all
Mhm.
sides, and I think she's trying to cut through that. And I'll let people make their own determinations. We're not necessarily subscribing to one particular perspective, but I think because she's done so much of her own trauma healing work, which she talks about in that episode, there is a lot to learn about how to make the personal into the political or into the social. And I think that's something a lot of people are struggling with, because we need to do our own healing work, but we are also living in a world that has a lot that needs to change. Otherwise, we're not going to have a healthy world for our children and grandchildren and
Mhm.
next generation. So, yeah, people like that are always fun.
Yeah, I love the ones that maybe are a little bit controversial, but get me thinking. And maybe I don't always agree with everything, but I love when it gets me thinking about things in a different way. And she definitely offers that.
Yeah. I think the one that stood out for both you and I, which also has to do with intergenerational trauma and intergenerational healing, was Judge Abby.
Mhm.
I just was so blown away by that episode. I knew I would based on what I had learned about her, but wow, so real, so down to earth, and the wisdom that she has embodied, which is not easy, when you've been cut off from your intergenerational wisdom. The work that she and her community have done to reconnect to that in a real way, in an embodied way, an authentic way, was just, I mean, it gave me shivers.
Mhm.
I wonder what you took away from that.
Yeah, she was just another one. I was so impressed. I don't know how else to say this. It's just there's a quality about her that, as she's sharing, it's matter of fact, but there's such heart there. Like, there was such
Mm,
heart, and you can really see even just in her eyes, and this is when I'm like, it would be great if there was a YouTube channel because I think a lot of folks
mm,
would really appreciate how she's showing up even, like, in a physical way.
mm,
I don't know how else to say that, Brad, but just the way she is and when you see her, and you can hear it in her voice too, but she's really special, and the work that she's doing is so, so important, and I definitely learned a lot in that conversation. Yeah.
mm. So as we pivot to 2023, anything that you're taking in terms of your learning, your growth, your intentions?
Well, I just gotta say we've recorded a few that haven't aired yet that I'm super excited about, and I know a few that are gonna be on in the spring and hopefully in the summer. So I'm really excited for what's coming up. So if we can just kinda put a plug for listeners to stick around, there's some more exciting conversations, some more guests that have a lot to offer. I'm really trying to just continue to settle into showing up and being human and being curious and this first year, there's so much learning for me, just even like silly things like technical stuff. Like, I gotta make sure my air conditioner is off. I gotta make sure my cat's out of the room, like some of those silly things that I can kinda stress myself out about. So now that I feel like, okay, those things I'm tracking, now I can, maybe settle in a little bit more to the experience a little deeper. So I know that might sound kind of silly, but those are things that I'm, tracking in terms of my growth. What else? Just the NARM model, just as I continue to learn more and understand even a little deeper about the model, I'm hoping that that will translate into the conversations that, as I'm showing up, that I can be even more NARM aligned. I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah.
Great. Yeah, I'm looking forward also to, the conversations. I like the way that we're kind of balancing people within our NARM global community that are integrating NARM in all these really cool ways, really interesting ways, but also having these conversations with people outside, not to push NARM in any way, but just to learn more. And there's always overlap. I haven't heard one episode yet where I haven't heard some significant overlap between,
Yeah.
the NARM model and other models. And I think that keeps, these models open and evolving and healthy, and also the relationships. I mean, we live in such a commercialized, society where everything has its trademark, and, everything's compartmentalized. And I'm always been a fan of interdisciplinary learning and bringing different systems together, even different fields together outside of psychology. I think it's so important. So I just appreciate, again, how we've been open to that and hosting these different voices and different wisdom.
Yeah, and so much appreciation for those who have been willing to come, even though they may not know anything about NARM.
Yeah.
Sometimes they've been like, I'm not even really sure what it is I'm putting out there that y'all want to hear about. And I'm like, it's okay. We're just going to have a conversation. And that's been really fun to learn from so many folks in different parts of the field and what they have to share.
Yeah, that's another fun thing, to pull back the curtain into the green room before we record. I've had a number of conversations where people are like, I don't know what this is.
Yeah.
I know it's a trauma podcast, but like, who are you guys? And
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, it's been fun. And then people get interested and read the book or listen to more of our podcasts. And sometimes they'll email me later and say, thank you. It's so been interesting to learn more about you and what you do. And so, yeah, those are cool
Mm.
relationships that we've been developing.
Yeah, that's fun.
Yeah, as we wrap up here, I just thought I would throw out a few numbers. I mean, this is episode 90, this one right now that we're recording. So, which means that we're moving into 2023 and we'll hit 100 at that point, which is just really cool. And we've had almost 500,000 downloads. I don't know what that means exactly, but that seems like a big number.
That's cool. Very cool.
Yeah, and our editor told us that we were in the top 1 or 2% of all podcasts, which is pretty incredible in terms of listenership and engagement. So we just wanted to appreciate every one of you that's listening right now,
Mhm.
that has taken something from these episodes, shared it with your friends, your colleagues, your family. We really appreciate this. The deep intention of our institute and this podcast is to make this work more accessible, to take it out into the world in whatever ways we can, so that these psychological principles don't stay just in the one-on-one therapy room, although it's important there too, but that it gets out into the world. So we just want to appreciate each one of you for being supporters. And Emily, once again, just thank you so much. I'm so honored and happy that you're part of our team here, and you've done such a wonderful job, and look forward to moving forward together into 2023.
Thanks so much, Brad. Appreciate that. Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. To find more about our guest and their work, check the show notes or visit us at narmtraining.com/transformingtrauma. Do you want to join the international NARM community in support of trauma-informed care? We are excited to be kicking off trainings in early 2023 designed to support those of you working with clients or populations dealing with the effects of adverse childhood experiences and complex trauma. For more information on these trainings and to apply, please visit narmtraining.com/schedule. We hope you will join us in 2023 for learning how to transform trauma. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Tori Essex for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We look forward to building community, connection with you, and changing the world by transforming trauma.